Hello everyone, and welcome to the 15th episode of Analyzing Evil. In this video, we'll be taking a look at John Doe from the film Se7en. This character is incredibly well designed, and the film is riddled with an extraordinary amount of minute details that coalesce into a character with a warped ideology and lifestyle that leaves us viewers entranced with the enigma that is John Doe. We're going to go through all of these details to get the most accurate portrait of John's mind and motives as we possibly can. I'd like to note that there is a comic book series that goes into some detail about the backstory of John Doe, and they're quite interesting. However, I'm sure that most people are unfamiliar with these comics, and for some people, the magic is in the mystery of a character, so I've chose to omit any reference to them in this video. If you'd like to see a separate video tying the comics into what we learned in this video, feel free to let me know down in the comments, and I'll explore that option in the future. Without further ado, we have an immense amount of information to cover, so let's begin. Rather than going through each scene of the film in order, I believe it's best to jump around quite a lot so we can apply what we learn in later scenes to earlier scenes. In order to give some structure to the intense magnitude of detail presented to us, I'm going to start by covering what we can decipher about the philosophy and lifestyle of John through the books listed in his library record and what we find in his apartment, before we move on to the murders he commits and his personality, and finishing with the finale of John's plan at the end of the film. Beginning with his library record, we can group most of the books into two obvious categories, those of a criminal nature and those of a religious nature, with special attention to the knowledge they contain on the 7 deadly sins. For the first category, Somerset names off books called Murderers and Madmen, Modern Homicide Investigation, and In Cold Blood, all of which we can assume John was reading in order to learn more about other criminals and criminal investigation to assist him in his murderous endeavors, as well as to help him avoid capture. I feel it's unnecessary to go into detail about each individual book in this category, as it's easy to imagine what exactly he was looking for within these books. The specific information I'm sure he gathered from the books in the second category, however, contain a lot of different themes and details that pertain to John's ideology, specifically the history of the 7 deadly sins. Each book he reads regarding the sins has information on the beginnings and evolution of thought on the sins over time. Let's take a look at each, going in order chronologically as they were written to understand why John may have been reading them. Starting with the history of Catholicism, I'm sure this is where John researched the formation of the concept, immersing himself in the very beginnings of his obsession, likely starting his research by looking into the writings of the monk Evagrius Ponticus, to the translation of the writings of Ponticus into Latin by John Cassian, to the eventual enumeration of the sins by Pope Gregory I into the list as we know it today. The origins of the sins is an interesting subject to study, and if you'd like to learn more about the formation of the concept, I encourage you to look into the writings of any of these men. There's a quote attributed to Pope Gregory I that John may have found in this book, and looked to for affirmation and comfort, and I quote, "The bliss of the elect in heaven would not be perfect unless they were able to look across the abyss and enjoy the agonies of their brethren in eternal fire." On his library record as well are the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas. From that title, we can assume that perhaps the book he was reading was a collection of various excerpts from his works, of which the most prominent regarding the subject of the 7 deadly sins is the Summa Theologica. In this massive compendium of Catholic theology, there is a subsection dedicated to vice and sin under the section First Part of the Second Part. This treatise on the subject of the 7 deadly sins delves into the defense of and argument against the sins, whether or not they're valid, and with the ordering and gravity of each. I imagine John was reading up on Aquinas to verse himself in the many aspects of these sins, giving him a more expert knowledge on the subject rather than just a surface-level understanding of the matter. If you're interested in reading the section of the Summa that covers the sins, I'll leave a link on screen and in the description where you can find this section. Next is the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri. Some of you may better recognize the name Dante's Inferno, and it's a common mistake to refer to the whole of the Divine Comedy as just the Inferno. But the Inferno is in fact only a part of the Divine Comedy, and there are actually 3 separate sections of the work, being Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. Dante was heavily influenced by the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, and it's been said that the Divine Comedy is the Summa in verse, a more entertaining elaboration of the works of St. Thomas. Thus, the Divine Comedy concerns many of the notions that Aquinas puts forth in the Summa Theologica regarding sin, but it gives the reader a more visual interpretation of the severity of the 7 deadly sins as Dante makes his journey through hell, purgatory, and eventually into heaven. The Divine Comedy is an enormous work on its own, and contains many lessons and themes regarding the sins. But what I think is most important here for us viewers regarding John is knowing that this story gives the reader a visualization of the punishments that people receive for committing a sin. It may be that John looked to the Divine Comedy for inspiration when deciding in which way he would punish each sinner he targeted, or for more reinforcement that sinners do indeed deserve the punishments they will undoubtedly receive once they reach the afterlife. Spoken of in the movie by Detective Mills is the Parsons tale from the Canterbury Tales, and though it's not on John's library record, I think it's likely that he'd also have read at least this particular tale, as it does tell the tale of penance in relation to the 7 deadly sins. Now, beside the fact that all these books are connected to the 7 deadly sins in some way, the other thing they all have in common is that they are all medieval, old-world books describing old-world thought and concepts as it relates to Catholicism. I'm not trying to say that these books don't have their merits now, but rather I'm trying to point out the fact that John is decidedly old-world in his thinking. Of course, John was trying to send a message with the brutality of each kill, but I believe the manner in which he punishes his victims reflects his old-world thinking, as the torturing of these individuals is something you'd expect to find in a medieval dungeon, rather than a modern-day city. Surely John had tailored these punishments to mimic what he believes awaits these people once they reach hell as well. That aside, this list of books that tread deeper into higher intellectual territory regarding Catholic thought shows us that John hasn't merely planned this endeavor with a basic understanding of the 7 deadly sins, but has delved so far into the intricacies of the subject that it would be fair to call him a scholar on the matter, immersing himself in every possible aspect of the 7 deadly sins. John likely built the foundation of his philosophy on the sinful nature of the world and its need for punishment out of his own observations, but found structure and reinforcement for these ideas within these tomes. I believe this is a sufficient summary of the usefulness John likely found out of these works, and how they may have shaped his philosophy and outlook on life. For the sake of this video not being 2 hours long, I'm not going to delve into each and every example of sin in these works. If you'd like to go further and do so yourself, I implore you to do so, as each of these individual works is a fascinating read on the subject. And if anybody has any particular lines or passages from these books that they believe relate well to John Doe, please let us know down in the comments. Now, there's only 2 books on John's reading list that don't fit into the 2 categories I described earlier, and those are the Marquis de Sade and Of Human Bondage. For those who don't know, the Marquis de Sade was a notorious sexual deviant, rapist, blasphemer, and pedophile who wrote many literary works that were of a pornographic and erotic nature. He was condemned to various prisons and insane asylums for 32 years of his life for his writings and his rape and abuse of men, women, and children. The word sadism is derived from his name, and the mental condition of sexual sadism disorder is also named after Sade. Sexual sadism disorder is distinctly different from other mild forms of sadism that you may find occurring between consenting adults. People who suffer from sexual sadism disorder derive sexual pleasure from the extreme pain, suffering, or humiliation inflicted upon others without their consent. Now, why would a supposedly pious man like John Doe be reading the works of such a prominent sinner and blasphemer? Well, he could be reading about him out of disgust, thumbing through the Marquis's books as an affirmation of his worldview and the devolution of society. Or, perhaps this is an indicator that John experiences not only gratification from his killings, but sexual gratification as well. I believe we can find reinforcement for this notion in the scene towards the end of the film, where Somerset is questioning John about his supposed martyrdom and the fact that he undoubtedly enjoys his work. John freely admits to the fact and states that there's nothing wrong with a man taking pleasure in his work. I believe that both are true, that John may have read the works of the Marquis to reinforce his own beliefs, while finding a literary outlet to satisfy his urges. I think this is a clever detail inserted into the film by the creators to urge us into this direction. But as this is all theory on my part, I could be wrong. Let me know what you think about this notion down below. The last book we're going to take a look at least for the moment, is Of Human Bondage. The only connection to the film I could find while scouring the internet was the fact that the creators likely inserted this book on the list because the author of the book's name is William Somerset, the same as Morgan Freeman's character. But upon looking into the themes of the novel, I found that its central themes are realism versus idealism, humans in bondage, and the illusion of free will. I'm unsure if the creators intended for the themes of this novel to apply to John, or if it was just put into the film as an Easter egg, but I believe the themes of the novel apply to John's philosophy nonetheless. Let's look at each theme in turn. My source for the themes of this novel, which I will provide a link to on screen and down in the description, describes the theme of idealism versus realism as it pertains to this novel as follows. At the center of the novel is the portrait of a young man who embraces an idealistic view of the world, which is systemically demolished and replaced with the construction of a hardened philosophy of realism. The more that he gets out into the world and comes into contact with actual people, the more tenuous his grasp on those ideals become until they slip entirely, and he embraces a more realistic view of the true nature of most people. I think perhaps John may have at one point had an idealistic view on life, as many of us do, especially in our younger years. But his philosophy has evolved over time into a combination of the two. He views the world as it is, and people for what they are, reducing them down to their vices to gaze into what he believes defines them more than anything else. But at the same time, he lives in his own idealized world, where he has been given a divine mission by God to hand out punishment to these individuals. The next theme, human bondage, and the title of the book are in reference to a work called Ethics by Benedictus de Spinoza. In the fourth part of Ethics, Spinoza theorizes that domination by human passions, which he refers to as effects, defines human bondage, an enslavement to one's emotions, so to speak. I feel the novel Of Human Bondage, being an example of this concept, would have likely given John affirmation that humans are weak creatures that have become slaves to the will of their own emotions, channeling their wanton passions into sin. Now, the final theme of the novel, the illusion of free will, doesn't apply to John's victims, but to John himself. I don't think John believes that the population is unable to abstain from sin as if they had no free will, but rather chooses not to, and that's why he's set about in punishing them. But for John himself, he specifically states that he was chosen, which indicates that he believes he has no say in the matter, and is thus incapable of straying from his mission. Again, a lot of theory on my part, but I thought at the very least this novel and its themes were worth mentioning. If anyone has any other insights into this particular work that could relate to John, let us know down in the comments. That's the end of the library list, and I think we've learned a great deal of information about John from just that list alone. But now let's head into his apartment to see how John lived and operated to find out what we can there. Right away, the most striking thing is the darkness of the space. Lit by only dim lamps that are reminiscent of sconces along the walls of an abbey, this gives his apartment a somber feel, and the black walls add to the gloom that permeates his living space. The windows are all shuttered, and John likely has them this way to keep wandering eyes from viewing the madness that is his living space, and to shut out the world around him. At first glance, the apartment seems like a creepy place you'd expect to find a few pentagrams in, but I think the way he set up his apartment is supposed to be more reminiscent of an old-world monastery, dark and dimly lit by candles, allowing for its only monk to keep out the burdens of the world and live his life in silent peace within his nest. We're given a shot of various tools he has set neatly in order, another peek into the obsessive planning John has gone through over what I'm sure is many years to aid in his work. Further into the apartment, Somerset finds drawers filled with holy water, rosaries, empty bottles of aspirin, and strangely enough, half a pair of dentures. I think this shows that not only has John gone so far as to remove his fingerprints as we learn later on, but that he's taken his teeth out as well to hide away his dental records. In the center of this same room is a pommel horse, indicating that John either has some skill in gymnastics, or more likely uses it as a source of exercise he can utilize without leaving his home. On the surrounding walls are images of his victims, and of course, the most striking thing about his sleeping quarters is the oversized neon cross surrounded by various pieces of Catholic iconography above his bed. Nearby is a replica of Jesus on the cross as well, no doubt giving our most pious monk a feeling of comfort as he lays next to it at night. Though his room is rather cluttered and dreary, it seems to be clean for the most part. We get a shot of Detective Mills rifling through his clothing, which are protected by plastic bags, reinforcing this notion and indicating that John to some extent has an obsessive compulsion with cleanliness and his appearance. After all, cleanliness is next to godliness. As well as the images of his victims on the walls, we find trophies dedicated to his kills, showing that John is perhaps guilty of another sin besides his confessed one at the end of the film, the sin of pride. Taking pleasure in one's work is one thing. Keeping idols to bask in is another. In his bathroom, we find a departure from cleanliness, perhaps showing us that the further we go into John's mad machinations, the further the order of his life devolves into a managed chaos. In this makeshift darkroom, we find not only pictures of his kills, but the photos he took of Detective Mills as well. I'm sure John has other photos of his victims' day-to-day lives lying around as well, using them to track their routines and stalk them, cementing the notion that this planning has taken months, if not years. Our next room is the greatest indicator of this, where John houses thousands of notebooks that he's written in over the years documenting his day-to-day life and the sinners he encounters therein. Now, I paused the film to read some of what was in these notebooks, and honestly, while it's interesting, it doesn't do too much good to sweat over the details of these notebooks in my opinion. As Detective Somerset says, they're just mind poured out onto paper. There are certain things squared off at points, but they still constitute the ravings about random people and their sins rather than anything of too much substance. At the very most, I'm sure if we looked through them all, we'd find bits and pieces of his own philosophy strewn in, but they would mostly consist of his rage-induced observations of the perceived sinners around him. We are given a sample of what little reference to his ideology lies within when Detective Somerset reads out a portion of one of the notebooks to Detective Mills. What sick, ridiculous puppets we are. What a gross little stage we dance on. Dancing, fornicating, not a care in the world, not knowing that we are not what was intended. This is a reference to the original sin of Adam and Eve, which transformed humankind into beings that God had not intended them to be, which led to the sad state of the sinners he sees around him in the present day. The only other interesting thing to take note of from his writings is that he's grouped the sections of these notebooks into different sins, indicating that there is at least a certain order to what he's writing. He keeps several large books in his room as well, likely theological in nature, showing that his research extends outside of what we found on his library record. In summary of his living situation, the man lives like a hermetic monk who spent who knows how many countless years collecting tools and knowledge to further the machinations of his plot in his holy abode, walling himself off from society in an attempt to escape the sins of the outside world. He lives among the idols of his Lord, and of his murders, basking in the glow of his God and his work in seclusion. Now that we've examined John's lifestyle and research, let's take a look at the murders he commits to come to an even better understanding of his thought process behind his plan. Before we get into each killing, though, I'd like to bring your attention to something we haven't discussed yet that will prove useful for some of the kills we examine going forward. And that's the counterpart to the 7 deadly sins, the 7 virtues. It's been said that the cure for each of the 7 deadly sins is each of the 7 virtues that are their direct opposites. To overcome gluttony, you must practice temperance. For greed, you must have charity. For sloth, you must be diligent. For lust, you must practice chastity. For pride, you must show humility. For wrath, you must have patience. And for envy, you must have gratitude for what you have. As I said, these 7 so-called cures for the 7 deadly sins will play into some of the kills we examine going forward, so keep them in mind as we continue. Now let's go in order from John's first kill. Bound and meant to eat himself to death. This kill is a gruesome sight to behold. While the murder itself shows us right away the lengths John is willing to go to prove his point, what's most important about this murder is the quote John leaves behind the fridge. Long is the way, and hard out of hell that leads up to the light. As Detective Somerset points out, this line is from the epic poem Paradise Lost by John Milton, and the line itself serves as a harbinger for the beginning of John's plans. But the beauty of using Paradise Lost here is also in the theme of the poem itself, which Milton describes in Book 1 as his attempt at teaching the ways of God to men. I believe this fits perfectly with John Doe's motives, as this is exactly what he's trying to do. He's trying to show the world that sinners are not only deplorable in his own eyes, but in the eyes of God as well, punishing those earthly vessels just as God will once they arrive at the gates of his kingdom, only to be cast down into eternal torment in hell. This again shows John's diligence in crafting his worldview and his plan, showing us that it's not simply a quote to drive home a point, but a window into the mind and thoughts of John himself. Unfortunately for our poor gluttonous fellow, he's not offered the chance for temperance, as he's made to eat until he dies. On to our next victim. The greedy lawyer Eli Gould is found lying in prostration over a stack of books in front of a scale, where he was made to exact a pound of flesh from his own body in exchange for his freedom. In Shakespeare's play The Merchant of Venice, a moneylender named Shylock gives a loan to Antonio Bassanio and requests that if he cannot pay back the loan in full at the date he specifies, Antonio must offer him a pound of flesh. No bone, no cartilage, but flesh. In this play, this is obviously meant to punish the greedy Bassanio, and John does so in the same way for Eli Gould. But as Eli could have won his freedom for exacting his pound of flesh, I believe this was how John offered Eli the chance of redemption for his sins through its corresponding virtue. Now you may be thinking, how is giving a pound of one's own flesh charity? Well, it isn't, but these virtues have alternate ways of qualifying as a virtue where charity is not applicable. In this case, that alternate virtue is sacrifice. If this lawyer can sacrifice his pound of flesh to pay for his greed, he'll be let free, giving his victim a chance to redeem himself through a divine virtue. The fact that this man is laid out in prostration is how Somerset comes to the conclusion that what John is doing is in fact preaching. Mills points out that he thinks it's punishment. I believe they're both right. John is preaching through punishment, educating the masses through grisly and sickening sermons. I'd like to point out a detail in this crime scene that the detectives conclude is meant for them to make a connection to the man's wife. The mask of blood around her eyes. I think this particular distinction for what we see on the frame is important. A mask. There's a story by Edgar Allan Poe called The Mask of the Red Death, which is a story about a disease that is ravaging an unknown land, and a nobleman who attempts to shield himself and his noble friends from this disease by walling all of them off in his keep. The nobleman proceeds to have a masquerade ball to entertain his friends, having them go through the 7 different colored rooms of his home. At midnight, an unknown man appears walking through the crowd in a dark blood-stained cloak and a red mask. The nobleman, Prospero, ends up chasing this man through the 7 different colored rooms of his home, and upon confronting the man in the mask in the final room, he meets his untimely end. The partygoers then proceed to assault this man, only to find beneath his mask and cloak there is nothing, an allusion to the disease that spreads its way through these people, an unseen force of death and doom. While yes, this clue left by John was certainly meant to point the detectives to the next link in the chain that is John's plan, I believe this story fits well with not only John, but his focus on the 7 deadly sins. It's not always agreed upon that the 7 rooms in the Mask of the Red Death are linked to the 7 deadly sins, but in this case, I think this interpretation is more than appropriate. As for the figure in the mask, an invisible threat in plain sight weaving its way through the crowd, is just like John before his reveal. This clue of course leads us to our next victim, the drug dealer and pederast made to suffer and waste away for an entire year before being found, and is in my opinion, John's most cruel murder of them all. Victor is found bound and broken beyond repair in his own home. Documentation of his horrible transformation into nothing more than a sickening shell of a human being over the course of a year, laid in view for all to see. The level of demented dedication and determination John has to have to be able to come into a man's home for an entire year and care for him as he tortures him is beyond gut-wrenching. Don't get me wrong, the man is a criminal, and a pedophile, and deserves to be punished, but this goes far and beyond cruel and unusual punishment. Interesting to note in this scene is California, the SWAT leader, leaning in to whisper in Victor's ear to tell him he got what he deserves, showing that it's not too far-fetched to make the claim that a good number of people might be in fact thankful for John's work. This case is one that had no chance of redemption through any of the 7 virtues, as there was no way a man so thoroughly incapable of escaping his punishment to have a chance at redemption. Our next victim, Our Lady of Lust, is a different story, however. While I don't believe she was capable of providing herself redemption, the man who kills her may have. If he had shown chastity, and chose to let John end his life, perhaps this woman may have been spared. John may have ended her life the same way, but I like to think that had this man chose to be chaste, this woman would have survived. In the end, though, whether he or this woman died, it would still serve John's ends, as the death of a lustful sinner would have still occurred. This kill is yet another example of the lengths John will go to prove his point, having an elaborate contraption manufactured to really sell the brutal fate that he envisions awaits all sinners. Then, of course, is our beautiful, prideful model, who is quite literally handed the chance at redemption. This woman could have shown humility and chosen to live her life with disfigurement, but just as I'm sure John predicted, she chooses to end her life rather than go on living this way. It's safe to say at this point that John is nothing short of a mastermind, and his elaborate plan and its fulfillment is impressive to say the least. But at last we've come down to the final act of John's macabre production, and this is where I believe it's time we move on to discuss the man himself, starting with his self-revelation to Detectives Somerset and Mills. Now, aside from the blood on his clothes, the thing most notable about John Doe is nothing, and that's quite something. A plain white button-up shirt, a pair of slacks and dress shoes, and a rather ordinary hairstyle atop a plain and unassuming face is what makes this man's appearance more terrifying than an outwardly vicious character. John Doe is in every sense a John Doe. If you saw him walking down the street, or standing in line in front of you at the grocery store, you likely wouldn't think twice. Why, you might not even notice him at all. A momentary fragment of memory lost quickly beneath the rest of your worries. He's nobody. No birth certificate, no DNA records, no real teeth, and no fingerprints, recorded or physical. A person couldn't be closer to nothing if they tried. The detectives assume he's well educated, and he very well could be, but he could have also been self-taught, a man whose life involves only what he himself has made it into. Though John is physically and socially the perfect nobody, mentally he's very much his own distinct person. We've had a good look so far at John's philosophies, and we'll get more yet, but now it's time we take a look at his personality. We get precious few lines from John at the end of the film, but throughout all of it, we get a good sense of the kind of person he is. When he's musing on his works with the detectives at the onset of their journey to his intended final destination, he becomes mystified as he speaks of his work and how it will be studied for years to come, showing again the sin of pride as he boasts about his accomplishments. He's a cocky, arrogant snob who looks down on everyone around him as nothing more than worthless sinners, evaluating people at their worst and summing up their entire character based on their flaws. He's a calm and collected individual for the most part, only prone to spurts of anger when it serves a purpose or when he finds himself on the defense in explaining his twisted worldview. He gloats over and taunts the detectives for even bothering to assume that they could have found him without him allowing them to. Altogether, John projects himself as a confident, snide, righteous, and unforgiving man who's sure in himself and of his perceptions of the people around him. The man is also without a doubt insane to a certain degree, as when Detective Mills asks him a ponderous question about his insanity, he replies that Mills is only choosing to view him as insane because it's comforting to him. John states to Mills that he in fact believes he has been chosen by God himself, and after Somerset asks him if he's doing the Lord's good work, John fittingly replies that the Lord works in mysterious ways. This denial of insanity is often said to be one of the hallmarks of the truly insane, as they themselves are incapable of understanding that they're insane. This is not always the case, but it's certainly true for some, and I believe it is partially true for John. He's clearly delusional, but he does state to his lawyer that he will go for the insanity plea if the detectives don't follow his wishes, indicating that he's not totally insane to the point that he has no sense of self-preservation, or as we've seen quite well already, that he lacks the ability to scheme and plot at an incredibly high functioning level. This is a great look at what kind of man we can view John as from what we're given. Now let's finish what he started and take a look at our last two sinners of his plot. Throughout this entire week-long ordeal, John has been many steps ahead of the men attempting to capture him. He's gone to great lengths to conceal his identity, mask his presence in the face of his victims and would-be witnesses, and crafted a plan so foolproof that if he had wished to avoid capture, he likely would have gotten away with all of it. But John had never intended to get away with it. Through years of stalking, gathering resources, and research, John crafted this plan with one motive in mind: to prove to the world that within all of us lay a sinner, including himself. He even went so far as to plan ahead, planning to use whichever detectives he found pursuing him in this plan, finding the perfect specimen in Detective Mills. Here at the end, we're made to believe John's plan has already been completed, and we're only waiting to find the last two bodies. But then we learn that John has committed yet another horrifying act, murdering and dismembering the wife of Detective Mills. What he says here is telling of his sadism. He tells Detective Mills he tried to play husband when he called upon his wife, and taste the life of a simple man. One can only imagine what he means. He could have raped her, tortured her, or played with her any way he liked before he killed her, leaving yet another bad taste in our mouths. Here we have a wrathful Detective Mills, goaded into making an impossible choice: vengeance or forgiveness. But he is given a choice, the chance at letting virtue be his guide rather than sin, the chance to have patience and to forgive John Doe. But through the unceasing taunts and masterful persuasion of John Doe, Detective Mills fails. In one fell swoop, John condemns both himself and Detective Mills for the sins they have committed, showing the world what it's become, leaving a brutal vision of torment for all sinners to fear with the completion of his plan, a vision of what awaits them at the end of their days if they do not turn from their sinful ways. While he leaves behind this message, he himself moves on to greet the God whose will he believes he's carried out on earth, at peace with himself and the way he was chosen to follow. So in the end, he did get away with it, away to a world without sin, into the arms of his Creator, who he surely believes will not only forgive him for his own sins, but applaud his work as he walks through the gates of heaven and into paradise. So what do all of these things make John Doe? They make him a scholar of Catholic thought, an expert in sin, vice, and virtue, a mad monk whose pessimistic outlook on the world and the people in it fester an obsessive need to cleanse this mortal plane of its most vile offenders, and bring a twisted light to the eyes of those who would see his truth. He's a mastermind of his own making, and a man of little import outside the plan he's so dutifully carried out in the name of his Lord. He's nobody. A man with an unknown name and background who's hidden beneath the shadows to exact his revenge upon a world ignorant of its wrongdoings. He's a righteous zealot of the worst kind, one who uses the excuse of a divine narrative to justify his horrifying actions, judging others as he judges himself through a warped lens of holy contempt. But most of all, he's a sick and sadistic man capable of torturous and murderous acts so heinous and cruel they leave even the hardiest of us cringing away in disgust. And he is definitely a man more than deserving of being labeled evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on John Doe? Leave a comment down below with your thoughts, and feel free to leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured in a future episode. Once again, thank you to all of my subscribers. The growth this channel has seen as of late is staggering, and I cannot thank you all enough. It's one of the best ways you can support me, and if you like my videos and haven't subscribed already, consider doing so, as it helps me out a lot. If you'd like to support this channel even further, you can do so by joining my Patreon, while getting access to some special perks as well. You can find a link to my Patreon on screen now, as well as a video I've made explaining my reasons behind creating this Patreon. You can also find a link to both down in the description as well. Thank you to everyone who's signed up so far, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and follow me on the social media platforms listed in the description for updates on the channel. You can also join the channel's Discord server by clicking the link in the description if you'd like to chat with other viewers or myself about your favorite villains. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.